Hi, so this is the first chapter for chapter 14, which is all about pricing strategies. And we're going to start off by talking about price discrimination. So obviously, in order to have any sort of ability to price above marginal cost, you need to not be in a perfectly competitive market. So we'll talk about price discrimination, which is basically when firms charge different prices to different consumers. We used to talk about first, second, and third degree price discrimination. I'll use those terms a little bit, but mostly we'll talk about terms that hopefully make a little more sense. Then we'll talk about a two-part tariff and then bundling. And so bundling is when you basically make consumers either require that consumers purchase products together or provide an option for them to purchase them together at a reduced price. And so we'll talk about also at the end of the chapter a lot of the sort of behavioral economics insights into how firms can take advantage of consumers' irrationality, especially when it comes to pricing. So a monopolist is in the position where they're the only producer of the good, but they still can't extract all of the consumer surplus. And that's because of the law of one price, right? They have to sell all of their goods at the same price. If they could charge different customers different prices, they'd be able to increase their profits. And that's really what price discrimination is about. And the question is, when are they going to be able to do this? And when is it going to be profitable? And also, when is it going to be legal? Now, one issue, obviously, is if you sell a good to me for $20 and you try to sell it to somebody else for $50, then I could buy as much as I want at $20 and then try to resell it to the other person at, say, $40, right? And so you have to either make resale impossible or impractical. And so sometimes price discrimination is more common in the service sector where you can't really resell the service. So here's an example. Roman Haas had a plastic called methyl methacrylate, and they charged $45 a pound to denture manufacturers and 85 cents a pound to other industrial users. And so obviously that's a big difference in price. And clearly the reason is that the denture manufacturers had a higher value for it than the other users, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you can charge a higher price. And so they started having problems because people were reselling the 85 cents a pound plastic to the denture manufacturers. And they actually, there's a memo in the book where Roman Haas considered poisoning the plastic sold for general industrial use, making it unfit for use in dentures, right? They talked about like adding a little arsenic so that you couldn't use it in dentures. They never did that, but apparently there were enough rumors about it that it stopped the denture manufacturers from buying the cheaper plastic, even though it was identical. So that's just one example. So we're going to start off here with first degree or perfect price discrimination. So perfect price discrimination, I think, is a good word for it. Basically, it says everybody gets charged their maximum willingness to pay. So you find out who has the most willingness to pay, you charge them that price at the top of the demand curve, and then you move down. It's really impractical, not possible, mostly because consumers have no incentive to tell monopolists how much they're willing to pay. You could argue that it gets closest in markets where there's a lot of bargaining or haggling, especially if the seller is a monopolist. They'll start off at that highest price and then they'll come down. Now, as I've said in class, as I've made the argument in class, university pricing is not completely dissimilar to perfect price discrimination because they ask for all your tax returns, right? You fill out your FAFSA and then they tell you how much you have to pay. If you had to do that in any other industry, you would say, no, I'm not doing that. So maybe college education is the industry where we get closest to perfect price discrimination. So if we think about it, we can think about it very easily, right? We have our demand curve, our standard demand curve. Here it's P equals 120 minus Q, and our cost curve is just 20Q, so our marginal cost is 20. And the monopoly solution is just setting marginal cost equal to marginal revenue and then pricing off the demand curve. And so the profit here is 50 units times 50, or 2,500. But if they can charge a price to each individual consumer, then they can not only extract this consumer surplus in this top triangle above the profit, but they can actually get rid of all of the deadweight loss. And so that's an interesting result of this perfect price discrimination, is that it's actually efficient in terms of comparing total surplus to the perfect competition outcome. We get the same amount of output, right? We get 100 units, and the last person pays marginal cost, $20. And here, profits now are 5,000, right? Because it's 1/2 times 100 times 100. And it's perfect because they extract all of the surplus, right? In perfect competition, all of this surplus would be consumer surplus, and there would be no profit. And in this case, all of the surplus is producer surplus, and there's no consumer surplus. So that's obviously a big difference. This is a little bit unrealistic, but at least it does provide us with sort of an extreme example of how firms would like to price discriminate. Now, a more realistic example is what used to be called second-degree price discrimination, is usually now called nonlinear price discrimination. And so here, this is just like basically bulk discounts, right? And so, they give an example of, going to the hardware store and buying nails, and it's $1 per ounce for the first 10 ounces and 50 cents per ounce after. And so 10 ounces will cost $10 and 20 ounces will cost $15. And so it's nonlinear because the price changes at some point. So there's a kink in that pricing schedule. So in terms of nonlinear pricing, one reason that firms might want to do it is because of cost asymmetry, right? So it might be easier to produce in bulk, or you might enjoy some economies of scale. But it will also allow some price discrimination where you're trying to get consumers to choose the package that extracts the most surplus from each type of consumer. So if we think about that a little bit more, so here we have our typical downward sloping demand curve. It's the exact same demand curve as we saw earlier. And so with linear pricing, right, we know that the output pair is $70 and 50 units for a monopolist. With nonlinear pricing, you can assume that the firm chooses a price of $80 when the consumer purchases a quantity of 40 or less, right? So they're going to sell that much to those consumers. And then for every unit after 40, the price falls to $60. And so now you can get this extra rectangle of producer surplus. And so in this case, profits are going to be $3,200 with nonlinear pricing, which is more than the $2,500 they could get with just straight monopoly pricing. And so the key is that you're basically segmenting people into those who want to buy a small amount but are willing to pay a high price, right? The people sort of at the top of the demand curve here, from the people who want to buy a larger amount at a lower price down here. And so you're trying to extract their surplus with each price break.